Good day and welcome back to the Ottawa History Hub podcast. I'm advised that in polite circles, you should avoid talking about politics or religion. And in my quest to have no friends, I've been talking about politics and neglecting religion like the heathen I am. So let's fix that and see whom I can alienate this week. Last week, we took a stroll around Bytown, getting a feel for what it's like on the ground in the first decade of the settlement. Throughout our walk, we found that many of the first buildings built were religious ones. The first church built in Ottawa was a Methodist one on Chapel Street. The first stone church was Presbyterian St. Andrew's at Kent and Wellington. And the first Roman Catholic church was at Sussex and St. Patrick's. They've all been built over since, sometimes with newer churches, and sometimes with condos. This raises the question of what's with all the different churches, and how early did the city become so religiously cosmopolitan? The city was planned out formally over lunch on 26 September 1826 by Governor-General Dalhousie, Lieutenant Colonel John By, Engineer John McTaggart, who were all Anglicans. Masons John Mackay and John Redpath were both Presbyterians, and Filman Wright followed a generic, non-denominational form of Protestantism. So from the beginning, there was a mixed Protestant population. Predominantly Catholic Irish laborers began arriving in October. Moses Bilski would be the first Jewish person to settle in 1856, so after the shift from Bytown to Ottawa, and the first Muslim resident was Hassan Mahmoud Wahad, arriving much later in 1903. Leaving the monotheists for a moment, the Algonquin of the region had practiced an evolving form of Midewiwin for centuries prior. Algonquin in particular present a couple of religious issues that also affect the white population. The first is conversion. Christianity is big on conversion of non-Christians, as well as sectarian movement within the extended Christian bandwidth. Like a game of spiritual Pokemon, you gotta get 'em all. Many indigenous people were rallied into different Christian sects, and many weren't. The second issue is polyfidelism. Many Algonquin would practice their traditional religion and go to church. Many Protestants who lived far away from their traditional church, but closer to a competing one, might choose to attend that one, rather than trudge through the snow and rain on a Sunday morning. As I go describing some of these religious groups, please remember that in 1826, things were different. Not every adherent of one church or another could give you a complicated explanation of the difference between their sect and that of their neighbors. Honestly, many can't do that today. We'll be painting with a broad brush, while acknowledging that there were many exceptions along the way. For example, if I say that Presbyterians were largely Scottish, or Scots were largely Presbyterian, that doesn't mean that all Scots were Presbyterian, nor does it mean that all Presbyterians were Scots. Second warning is that just because some populations practice the same religion doesn't make them bosom friends, nor does a conflicting religion make them blood nemeses. Scottish Protestants and Scottish Catholics got along largely well in Upper Canada, and Catholic Irish and Catholic French fought viciously in Bytown in the 1830s and 40s. In Canada, we typically use the metaphor of cultural mosaic instead of the Yankee melting pot. And I like this metaphor. You blend red and yellow and you get orange. But with a mosaic, you still have red, you still have yellow. And by placement, you can create an image of something new and beautiful, rather than the nondescript soup that steals uniqueness from its components. Our first guests on this mosaic of religion are going to be the Catholics. The numerous work hands who migrated from Montreal to Lower Town were mostly, though not uniformly, of the Catholic faith, with the French being typically born in Lower Canada, and the Irish being typically immigrants from Old Erin's Isle. You would think that they might find community through shared religion and a history of suffering at the hands of our friends the English. And while there were certainly some friendships and intermarriages, there was also animosity and competition for resources. The French were initially employed as bûcherons, or lumberjacks, on the Rideau River, and for the emerging timber trade on the Ottawa. They were culturally, religiously, and linguistically tied to Lower Canada. And in these days before the construction of the 416 to Kingston, the trade and cultural contact in Bytown put it into an orbit of Montreal much more than the Upper Canada administration. For the French Catholics, religious ceremonies were largely performed by lay or itinerant clergy. The population was largely male, so marriages and baptisms would be done back home in Lower Canada, and services would be done in home churches. The first purpose-built Catholic church was Saint Jacques, a wooden church built on the grounds of what's now Notre Dame Cathedral Basilica. Saint Jacques was built in 32, and construction of the much grander Notre Dame began 9 years later. The Irish sense of community was more complicated than that of their French co-religionists. They were immigrants. Going back home for Holy Week was not an option, the way that it was for the Lower Canadians. Despite that, they wouldn't have a church of their own until 1855, when St. Patrick's was founded in Uppertown, centered on what's now St. Patrick's Basilica on Kent, though that current building wouldn't start construction until 1869. The Irish were new to Bytown, but not to Upper Canada, and certainly not new to the British Empire. 2 years before the Rideau Canal began, the Bathurst district was up in arms with fighting between the Irish and English settlers. In what's now Renfrew, Carleton, and Lanark counties, Ballygiblins, as the fresh-off-the-boat Irish would style themselves, had met the local militia with violence, as was reported in the Montreal Herald, one of the largest and most pro-British newspapers of the day. As we discussed the role of the militia in earlier episodes, I won't go into great detail, but typically most Protestant men would be considered part of the militia. They would be taught the basics of military life and how to handle small arms at home. Remember that much of the settlement in Upper Canada were veterans of the War of 1812 and the American War of Independence before it. In peacetime, they were only expected to show up for roll call once a year. So on that once per year of 1824, the tavern in Bathurst district was harassed by Irish discontents, and the militia restored civility by attacking a depot frequented by Irish, arresting 19, injuring 2, and killing 1. As I mentioned before, the Montreal Herald was a pro-British newspaper. Those Bathurst Irish were recruited out of County Cork to act as farm workers on Loyalist smallholdings in the Ottawa Valley, as part of Britain's effort to depopulate the colony of Ireland. The concern among the Protestant landowners was that their largely Catholic workers were bringing their old world problems and cultural baggage with them, as membership in the Orange Order grew to prevent this. Hello, Pot. I'd like to introduce you to my good friend Kettle. You'll find you have so much in common. Not all Irish were Catholic, and there were issues of nationality and class which divided the proletarian Irish from their landowning, largely Protestant, Anglo-ascendancy. While the Catholics have been divvied up largely along ethno-linguistics, the Protestants are a little more complicated than that, largely because there were just so many different Protestant denominations. I'm going to go over some of the cultural and institutional issues of the different major sects that were represented in Bytown, rather than Upper Canada. Anglicans. The Church of England was respectful of the marital proclivities of Henry VIII and broke from the Catholic Church in 1534. At that time, Catholics saw the Pope as the head of the Church, and Anglicans saw the King as the head of the Church. Over the next couple of centuries, more differences developed, the theology of which is minor to our historical narrative. When the 13 colonies declared independence, the large percentage of the population that followed the Church of England did not want to be associated with jolly old England, and renamed themselves Episcopalians. Many in Scotland felt the same way and took the same name. In Ireland, followers of the Church of England took the name Church of Ireland. In 1867, the Church of England invented the Anglican Communion, of which the Church of England and the Episcopalians of the United States and Scotland and the Church of Ireland are all members. Many immigrants to Upper Canada were from the States and called themselves Episcopalians. Many would call themselves Church of England. I'm going to be using the term Anglican to describe the lot of them. The State Church of England was the Church of England, and the State Church of Scotland was the Church of Scotland, a more Presbyterian version of Protestantism, and the Church of Ireland is a member of the Anglican Communion, like the Episcopalians. Most of the leadership cadre of the Rideau Canal project were Anglican. Most government officials were also Anglican. The first Anglican church in the Ottawa area was St. James in Hull. It was built in 1823 before the arrival of John By and the Canal Force. The first Church of England on the south shore of the Ottawa was Old St. Mary's Church, built on the site of New St. Mary's Church at Penny's Point in 1827. There were no dedicated Anglican churches in Bytown proper until the 1860s, after it had become Ottawa. One of the reasons for this was numbers. Anglicans had status within the state, so why would they move to some backwoods in the middle of nowhere to try and eke out a living? They wouldn't, but religious minorities would. The Anglicans who were here were largely associated with the government and administration and were posted to the region rather than migrating there. For their pastoral needs, there was a chapel on Barracks Hill or across the river in Wrightstown. But the Anglican community was barely large enough to field a regular hockey team at this point. Presbyterians, on the other hand, were, largely hailing from Scotland, which from 1750 to 1860 was undergoing a social phenomenon called the Highland Clearances, or the eviction of the Gaels, wherein tenant farmers were pushed off their land to make room for grazing cattle, cows being much more profitable than human-scale farming. These people were much more likely to sail across the ocean in search of a new life than were their more comfortable and settled Anglican brothers and sisters. The C of E had some advantages beyond simple status back home. As the official confession of state, they started out with a near monopoly on the glebes, the land distributed to the churches in official towns like York, Kingston, and Perth. Remember that just as a guinea pig is not from Guinea, does not cost a guinea, and is not a pig, Bytown was not a town. It didn't even have a town council until 1 January 1850. Because it was not a town, there was no land given to the church. Churches were just buildings that bought or leased land and were not given territory to support the church until then. Prior to incorporation, the small Anglican community would expect that there would be land allocated to their church in time, but that struck on a controversy of the day, pitting the Anglican Bishop of Toronto, Scotsman John Strachan, against a Methodist firebrand named Adolphus Egerton Ryerson. Ryerson insisted that there should be no official religion other than a general sense of Protestantism, and advocated for what was called volunteerism, which means that communities would freely support the religious institutes of their own. So instead of the state giving swaths of a town to the Anglican Church and providing the establishment with a source of income, the church should minister to a community, and if that community valued the institution, then it would find roots. If not, like any commercial venture unable to pay its bills, it would fold. Newspapers would come to Bytown from York and Kingston, where this debate would be front and center. The conservative Patriot would print Strachan's defense of the Church of England, and the Methodist Christian Guardian was edited by Ryerson himself. William Lyon Mackenzie's Colonial Advocate would be more sympathetic to the Methodists, or at least more hostile to the family compact that supported the Anglican monopoly. And George Brown's Globe was partisan to the liberal cause against the conservative status quo. The local newspaper, the Bytown Independent and Farmer's Almanac, wasn't founded until 1836, and was less political and more farm-centered, until it was rebranded as the Bytown Gazette, which had a strong Tory bias. The Bytown Packet was founded in 44, and in 51 it rebranded as the Ottawa Citizen, which still operates as a newspaper, despite its ownership by Post Media. In the end, the glebes became more ecumenical in their Protestantism, and the first glebe in Ottawa was a large tract of land given to St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church in 1837, and they would rent out territory for revenues. The glebe is a very nice neighborhood to this day, with lots of nice churches, not just Presbyterian. Anglicans and Episcopalians had formal leadership from appointed bishops, in Greek episkopos, and Presbyterians from elected community leaders or elders, which are called presbyters. Presbyterians, Reformed, Catholics, Knoxists believed in the sovereignty of God, and that all was running along on God's predetermined holy plan. Methodists, Wesleyans, had bishops like the Anglicans and Catholics, but believed in free will and the importance of personal experience of the divine. Salvation could be attained, but it could also be lost. In 1925, the Methodists, the Congregationalists, and a large component, but not all, of the Presbyterians would enter into a covenant together and form the United Church of Canada, the church in which I was raised as a child and now no longer participate. Then, as now, there were also those who chose not to participate. Overt atheism wasn't really a socially acceptable option, but curmudgeonly non-participation sure was. In addition to churches, there were also faith-based organizations. Of these, the most obvious would be hospitals. We don't necessarily think of modern hospitals as religious organizations, although many of them do have names like Saint Such and Such. And the symbol for medical attention is literally a red cross. Bytown's first large-scale civilian hospital was set up by Elizabeth Briere and the Sisters of Charity in 1847. The Catholic Bishop of Ottawa, Joseph Bruno Guigues, established the College of Bytown in 1848, which would eventually go on to become Ottawa University. Most schools were organized by one church or another, although our friend from last week, John Mackay, started the first secular school in the city. Masons' lodges existed in Bytown since the earliest days, and while not affiliated with any particular denomination, Masons certainly contained a spiritual element and a general belief in a supreme creator that was sine qua non for membership. If Mason lodges were religiously neutral, then their institutional cousins in the Orange Order certainly were not. Orange Order lodges were militant Protestant clubs across the British Empire that celebrated the victory of Protestant armies over their Catholic neighbors. They're not technically listed as a hate group in Canada, but there certainly have been an awful lot of hateful people on their membership rolls. There's still a Loyalist Orange Lodge in Ottawa on Rosemount, but the order is most active as an anti-Catholic sectarian group in Northern Ireland. Religion is not as important today in our public discourse as it was in the first half of the 1800s, but many of the oldest and nicest buildings are religious, and many now secular institutions have their roots in the sectarianism of days gone by. Public education is still incongruously divided between Catholic and Protestant boards, though Protestant has long given way to public. Cities like Toronto and Montreal have long histories of violence between sects, while intercommunal violence in Bytown was largely between ethnic and linguistic groups instead of religious ones. I cannot personally attest to which option is better or worse. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Ottawa History Hub podcast. Please subscribe. If you could leave a 5-star review or comment, that would be appreciated. If you'd like to contact me, the easiest way is either from the website at ottawahistoryhub.com or via email as ottawahistoryhub@gmail.com. You can follow me as the Ottawa History Hub on Facebook or Blue Sky, or as Ott History Hub on Twitter X. Next week, we're going to be back to discussing economics and trade and revisiting what's new in the fur trade. Until then, advance Ottawa, en avant!